Hey YouTube, this is just going to be a video. It's a critique of Zimbardo's talk at TED. Now, before I really begin and get into it, let me just tell you a bit on where I stand and where this critique's going to go. Right, Zimbardo, I really have a lot of respect for him. I have a lot of respect for the fact that he kind of revised certain implicit assumptions in the standard psychological view. It's not that there were implicit or even explicit dispositional attitudes within an individual, but it's merely that the situation and the context will have a far greater influence on determining the behavior of the individual than the disposition. In fact, the context will create the dispositional attitudes of the individual. So I really think that's important. And I think that's an important contribution that's been made to psychology at large. Now, what I have trouble with in Zimbardo's view is that he still draws up this dichotomy of good versus evil, which I think is ultimately somewhat destructive, and I don't think it helps very much at all. So that's where this critique is going to go. Right, so let me just give a little bit of background on Zimbardo and the other social psychologists of that era. Now, Zimbardo was one of the first social psychologists that I read, first psychologist I read really, way back in college, which to you guys is high school kind of. And well, Zimbardo's view, his experiment was to test whether it was dispositional attitudes or, you know, the situational and institutional attitude, the situational and institutional variables that gave rise to behavior. So he gets a bunch of college students, he puts them, some as prisoner, some as guard, and he watched their behavior change accordingly because of the actual institution and the function and the structure of that institution, and how it gave rise and sort of mediated certain types of behaviours. In the guards, obviously, sort of anger, indifference almost, and you know, the ability to carry out acts which are really inhuman. And in the prisoners, acts of passivity, sort of resentment, and you know, they were very passive, and they each started to play out their roles more than you'd think that they would. And this is very, very important, because it does show us that the particular ways that institutions are organised, the particular ways that they're run, etc., gives it really determines the behaviour a lot more. Now, just on a side note from this, if anyone's interested in other issues on, you know, torture, American prisons, the ideology that sort of allows this to go through, and even Britain's complicitness in the activities, there's a very, very interesting documentary series on Channel 4's Dispatches. I found it on All You See, which I think you'll be able to find it on the Channel 4 site, but it's a series of videos that look into the actual structures of the institutions and analyse the ideology in a way that I think even Zimbardo would be pleased about. So that's certainly worth checking out. And it kind of follows on from this, because it makes, once you understand the implications of Zimbardo's experiment, it doesn't make the Guantanamo Bay and other such things less shocking, but it does make them less surprising, if it is the particular way that the institutions run, it's the ideology which is in effect a product of social relations, etc. So I think that's majorly important. There are also a few other social psychologists of that era that had very similar views. I'm thinking just off the top of my head, Ash and Sharif, they did things to do on conformity, which are very interesting, but someone I'll touch on a little bit more, it's Milgram. And you obviously, a lot of you know Milgram's experiment. What Milgram actually hypothesized was, this was just after World War II, he hypothesized that there was a certain dispositional attitude within German people for obedience. So he carries out a pilot study just at his university. He carries out a pilot study just to see if it works. And most people in the university, American citizens, would be willing to obey at the point of causing severe risk or even death to another person. Now, this was so shocking that it sort of demonstrates that it's not necessarily that the German people were intrinsically bad in the fact that they had dispositional attitudes of evil, any more than the American people who obeyed this in this experiment had the dispositional attitudes, but it was the situation that gave rise, and it was very context dependent. So once we've got this idea that, you know, it is the particular situation, it's our institutions, it's the way that things are run, it's how responsibility is distributed, then, you know, you'd think that we'd learn to be able to organize our institutions in a way that kind of directs behavior in a way that will be socially beneficial for the common good. Now, what I think is Zimbardo's flaw here is if we're seeing the particular behaviors, indeed the particular beliefs, desires, intentions of those individuals in that situation, given that context, as products of that situation and that context and that institutional role that they perceive themselves to be in. Surely the beliefs themselves, the words, are also social relations, so the concept of good and evil itself is something dependent on social relations. Now, Zimbardo then commits what I think is a fallacy when he goes on to draw up this dichotomy of good versus evil. Now, I'm not a complete moral relativist. I believe that there are some issues that are general to humans, not necessarily all humans, but general, like our aversion to suffering. Just for an example, I think there are certain structures in the Levi-Strauss sort of structuralist way, but I wouldn't push it too far, because we are products of social relations. So Zimbardo sort of goes on to say we want to encourage good behavior and you know, try and blot out the bad, whereas of course this is to be admired, but when he talks about setting up hero schools and whatever, like, one man's hero is obviously another man's villain, and this is what I see as kind of the destructive side of Zimbardo's argument coming up. If we're encouraged to commit behaviors which might be heroic, even as Zimbardo says, when the social norm is going the other way, what's to stop someone from committing, say religious fundamentalism? Is obviously the fanatics obviously perceive that they're doing the ultimate good, but also patriotism, imperialism, etc. What's to stop those forces from acting as they would think heroically if they were encouraged under this ideology? I also think that the issue sort of whitewashes many questions in ethics. He doesn't really even talk about any ethical frameworks, much as they might be relative, sort of limited. For example, he could have mentioned he was working under a framework, utilitarianism. He could have mentioned he was working under a Kantian framework. Really anything to justify his position on this matter. I think what would be more consistent is if he sort of talked about moral relativity, but if he did that, then I don't think he'd be able to draw this dichotomy at all. So in those ways, I really think as much as it's trying to be helpful, it's trying to talk about the dangers of institutions that are arranged in a negative way. I think it's ultimately destructive. So I hope to hear your views on it. Peace.